And I don't know if you guys know how hard the folks work that put this all together, the directors, the producers, the camera crew, the audio folks back there, and they do a lot all year long at Full Sail. So let's give them a round of applause too. So welcome to the UX panel. My name is Shawn Stafford. I have a PhD in Applied Experimental and Human Factor Psychology. I also run the UX lab here at Full Sail University. And I've been doing research in this area for about 15 years. And I'm going to introduce our panelists. These are the important people here today. Dr. Adams Greenwood-Erickson. Adams is a colleague in the research lab here at Full Sail for UX. He also has his PhD in Applied Experimental and Human Factor Psychology. He focuses on educating students in UX, and he's a regular at GDC, presents every year, Games User Research Summit, great guy. Also, Celia Hodent, another PhD here, PhD in Cognitive Psychology. Director of the User Experience at Epic Games. Come on. Yes. So make sure your questions are right to the point so you can get a nice job in the industry when you talk to Celia. She's going to be...
bribes as well.
What's that?
Accept bribes as well.
Yeah, bribes. Yes, indeed.
Large bills only.
Yes. So Celia, she's going to be responsible for building up the UX division at Epic over the next few years, and the processes, the strategy, and everything that goes into how Epic does UX. And I'd also like to introduce another folk from Epic Games, Grant Shonkwiler. Grant,
Colonel Grant Shonkwiler.
Yes,
I want a title too.
Yes, yeah. He'll be the one non-PhD on the panel, so you should listen to everything Grant says and ignore the rest of us. So, Grant is a game dev grad from Full Sail University in 2008. Very cool. And
Survived.
he's a producer at Epic Games right now, and he's working on Fortnite. And yes.
Nice.
He's had a pretty broad career in the gaming industry. He's been a programmer, a designer, an audio designer, and also a producer. So he's got a lot of thoughts to bring to the table when it comes to UX and from all the different aspects that you can do in the game industry. And then another PhD at the end of the table down here, the lovely Theresa Becker. So Theresa. She's the non-psychologist PhD, which means she's smarter than us. PhD in instructional technology. She's the curriculum chair for the Mobile Game Engineering Master of Science program here at Full Sail, and she's course director for usability engineering and approaches to game design. So a round of applause for all of our panelists. So an hour's going to go rather fast. So what we're going to do is we already have some questions for the panelists. I've got those questions, and I'll go through them, and each panelist will get a question, and we hopefully can get through more than 4 questions. But after each question and after the panelists have a discussion, I'll go out to the audience, and we'll have you guys ask questions related to that particular question, and we'll do that for the remainder of the hour here. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first question is going to be for Theresa at the end of the table. Hi, Theresa.
Hello.
And an important question. What is UX?
Yeah, that is very important. I can't hardly see any of you guys, but how many of you know what UX is right off the bat and came to this session specifically because you already know? All right, actually, that is awesome. Someone, 2 hands up. So that goes a long way, actually, towards maybe being able to allow us to have a little bit more depth in the discussion. But for those folks that are in attendance who don't know what UX is, it stands for user experience. And user experience is a little bit of a broader term than has been used in the past when we talk about usability and how user-friendly the game is. I'm going to stick to focusing this directly on games because I think that's what you guys all came here to hear about. So we're going to leave off all of the other products that this applies to. What it really is in a nutshell is how the player interacts with the game and how we kind of collect data and take that data back and use that in the design in order to be able to either make the game the best it can be before it hits the shelves or before it's downloadable, or after the fact, and to be able to improve it upon updates. So it's a living process. It's multidisciplinary. It draws from psychology. It draws from social science, cognitive science, neuroscience, physiology, even things like anthropology, economics, probability and statistics. There's a lot of different fields that you can kind of gain entry to this from, or perhaps have something to contribute, alongside all of the things that we understand, like possibly AI research, programming development, and just human behavior is really what we're looking at in anything that comes into human behavior. So in the past, we kind of had to focus more on usability, which was just more the practical aspect of this. Things like learnability, memorability, how easy it was. I'll do learnability for a moment. How easy it was for the program to be learned, or the game to be learned, for maybe a novice to get in there and immediately know what to do. Memorability, how was it to remember what to do once you were in there? Efficiency, did you have to do 15 different clicks in order to be able to get what it was that you wanted? How easy was it to be able to use the controls, to be able to, acquire that loot that you were looking for? Things like errors, nobody really likes errors. Sometimes they're funny, but, we want to make sure that errors, and the errors I'm talking about here are things like that are going to affect the gameplay, that are going to affect the user experience. So not so much Q&A, does the game actually run, does it crash, but things like maybe incorrect mental models in the player, like you used the wrong color scheme and that triggered some sort of thought on the player of how to react, and it wasn't the correct way that you needed to interact in the game. So that and satisfaction. So that was the original kind of core of usability, and then UX brings in a whole other area which focuses a little bit more on the affective nature of things. So how players feel about the game, what their motivations are for playing it, whether or not they're going to come back to the game. And so in a nutshell, that's really what UX is. If you guys are interested, one of the founders, if you haven't done a lot of background on this, one of the great places to get started is with Don Norman, The Design of Everyday Things. And he talks a lot about, just some of the real basic things like affordances. When you're going through a door, is the handle on the inside or the outside? Are you supposed to push it or pull it? Some of you are nodding your heads, so I know you're already very familiar with this. Trade-offs is something I deal with a lot for my students, because I do mobile technology, mobile games, and there are a ton of trade-offs that you have to deal with in designing a game for a mobile device. So that for us is a very important part. And I know that the other folks on the panel have a lot to add. I'm sure Celia wants to jump in, so we're going to maybe.
You said it all.
Let's go.
No, it's the only thing that really is important in user experience, well, you have the user and the experience. So we have to nail down who the user is, your audience, who you're actually talking to in your game, and nail down what your experience is going to be about. Because we're not going to do the same job at giving back you recommendation, whether they're depending on the experience you intend and depending on the audience you're trying to reach. So really, if you can nail down these two things, it's going to help us to do a better job at giving you recommendation and help you really convey the design, the intentions that you have. So we're here to help, right?
Grant or Adams, want to add to anything here?
Nope.
Nope.
Thank you, Grant.
One thing I did forget, and I'll bring this up now because then it'll let these guys talk about it a little bit more, is it's based on research methodologies. There's a lot of them, typically qualitative or quantitative research methods like talk aloud, where you have the player sit and play the game and you listen to what they say and you don't say anything. You try to be a fly on the wall, and then you collect that data and are able to use that. So that goes a long way towards being able to understand what the player experience is without your influence being a part of that data. It's a process, so it's not something that you should think about at the very end of the game.
Yeah, that's a great point. When people, we usually get about, around probably 100 companies a year that will come by the UX lab here at Full Sail, and most of them will ask like, hey, what do you guys do, and what is UX? And typically I'll go into a long, boring conversation about it was founded in HCI, human computer interaction, or industrial engineering, or human factor psychology. But then it just boils down to, well, we make things more efficient, we make them better, and we make people more money. And they always kind of perk their ears up at more money. They're like, okay, yeah, we want to talk to you guys. So, it's a tough question to answer because I think UX is this user experience collective, and we have all these tools. And usually when I see senior scientists have to explain it to their management within the company, they'll usually explain it from a tool approach. They'll be like, well, we do usability tests, we do cognitive tests, we do play tests, we do focus groups. We have all these really cool tools that they can bring to bear, and every one of us is probably we have a ton of experience with those tools. But leading to our next question, I think with that first question, well, first off, does anybody have any thoughts or want to ask a question about that? Maybe how you've heard UX design. That's kind of like a low-hanging fruit question, but it's a good question to ask too. If not, we'll move right to the more. Oh yes, go ahead. Right over here on the left.
Well, okay. I'm a game dev student. I've definitely heard of UX before, but one thing I guess I'm curious about is how does it compare to UI? Because UI is probably like a more specific version of it, but UX kind of encompasses that along with everything else pertaining to the user. So what does that exactly mean for UI anymore? Is it now only UX? Is that what we care about now? Or
who would like to take this one?
I'll take it.
Okay.
Everyone wants to.
I'll start talking. All right.
Adam's
Great
got
user
this.
experience.
Into the breach, right? So at some level, so UI is the sort of front-facing piece that we show to a player, right? So the UI is you can think of this as like if you're building a home stereo system or a theater system, you have a device that takes the information in and reads it off of a disk or some other source, and then you have a device that displays it, and then you have this cable that connects the two, right? And the quality of that cable, in many cases, what actually determines the quality of the connection between the system and the display, right? Same thing's kind of true when you're dealing with someone playing a video game, right? You've got this very powerful information processor in a console or a PC, and then you've got this very powerful information processor right up here behind your eyes, right? But in between those two, we have this relatively limited bandwidth of communication. And the art of building a good UI is about getting as much information as efficiently through that limited bandwidth as possible. So UI is a big piece of user experience, but it's only a piece of user experience. So when you're designing a UI, that's a big piece of this, but user experience is about a much broader sort of scope on this. It's, how did you feel when you came in and why? How do you feel when you first see the environment that you're acting with? What is your mental state throughout that process? Are you overloaded? Are you underloaded? These are sort of cognitive concepts, but they're helpful to us in understanding whether somebody is engaged with the system or not. How does the user experience evolve over time? When you first started, Theresa talked about learnability and memorability, and these are often a big deal early on. And we look a lot at this in defining things like barriers to entry or first-time user experience, where it's like, hey, what stops someone from enjoying your game in the first 5 minutes? But there's also a piece of this that stretches out a lot longer. Why is someone sticking to your game after 30 hours or 60 hours or 200 hours? Why does someone keep playing this game but not this game? And sort of studying that, understanding that is also part of UX, which goes sort of broader and deeper than just issues related to the UI. Did that address your question? Awesome.
Anybody else want to add something to that one?
Yeah, UI is part of it, but it's just like UI is part of the video game, and the experience you have from the video game is the experience of it all. So it's also about the controls, it's also about the camera, it's about the characters, it's about motivation of you playing the game. It's even about downloading the game. So it's all of it. It's the experience of the whole game, and UI is just part of it. And that's audio and all
It also maybe allows us to address the idea of the UX as a process, as a methodology. So, when you're looking at your UI, for many of you, if you are in dev or design, you may have in your mind an idea about how you want the user to interact with the game, how you want to gain entry to that, how you're going to organize your information. And unless you take your mental model, your idea of what that is, and you begin to interact with the users and the players and come up with some mock-ups and prototypes, use design patterns and things like that we know work, and put those in front of a user and see how they actually interact with the software, you're not going to be able to iterate on that enough to be able to get a UI that really does what you want it to do, because chances are, even though we're great, we're only one person, and our idea for how users might interact with something may not be at all how they're actually going to behave, and you need to put that in front of them for that.
Yeah, those are all great answers. And I think another thing that where there might be a little bit of confusion in the industry is usually these UI, UX positions are put out by human resources in companies, and they don't quite know what those positions do. So sometimes they'll ask for a UI person, but really what they want is someone who can do it all, and UI is a part of the game. But then there's the other part, UI designers, and depending on the size of the company, I mean, Epic has everything, UX, UI designers, and all those things. What's that?
All the things.
Yeah, they have everything. But the smaller the company, your UI designer might be the person who's most interested in UX, so they end up doing everything. But I think from our experience working here, UI designers typically are the ones who are in contact with us throughout the process, with the producers as well, because they control everything. Right, Grant? Yes. So our next question is going to be for Grant, actually, and it's how does the interaction between dev and UX and producers and UX work?
Yeah, so I'm kind of come off of that last question because one of the things you said that's really interesting about the different sizes of teams is at Epic we have, on Fortnite we actually have 6 people on our UI UX team. So we have 2 people who are really focused on UX design, and then we have 2 programmers and 2 artists, as well as using Celia's team to kind of work through that process. But when I was in my first job in the industry, and when I kind of moved from being a programmer to being a designer, I was the only person really who was interested in UX. I didn't know that UX was a thing. I just knew that people were having trouble playing the game and that I needed to figure out ways to make that work. And so as the lead designer, I became the person who was championing UX. The artists just wanted pretty things and the programmers just wanted faster and more pretty things, right? So I became the person who was focused on trying to figure out what that meant, and kind of through reading and following, different things on Gama Sutra and reading different books, Design of Everyday Things and things like that, I started to realize that there was this kind of smart people science-y thing going on. And I started out by, just like, whoa, if I kind of just observe someone playing, I'll figure out what's wrong. And it's really interesting because when you're making a game, when you're on the development side, you're looking at a game like this. The game's here, but you're here. And so you don't actually see the entire scope of the game, and you don't see what it's like to be a new person playing the game. And so that instant when you have someone play the game who's not familiar with it, is not QA or is not a developer on the team, it breaks your soul, because you're like, yes, they will understand all the things, and then they are like clicking on the wrong button the whole time, and you're just like, I hate everything. And so I often use one specific example to kind of encapsulate when I realized that I needed to learn about UX. So I was working on a game. For anybody who's played the Megatouch over there, I was lead designer at Megatouch for a few years, and there's a game on that machine called Jackpot Corner, which is based off of a Japanese style of game. And so we were bringing that over to the US, and we wanted to kind of see what people would think about it. And one of the main mechanics of that game is after you do a certain number of things, a lever pulls up, and just like a jackpot, you press the lever and it spins and it gives you a whole bunch of points. Now, if you don't do that, you can never score anywhere close to a high score, and you never really get to the next level or anything like that. It's a very, very much a core mechanic of the game. And so we built the game. It was already, the art was at the level that you see in the game over there. And I'm sitting there watching someone play who had never played before. I think it was one of our hardware designers or something. and the lever's there, and it like shimmers, and he plays, and he finishes, and I'm like, did you see the lever? And he's like, there was a lever in the game? And I was like, yeah. And so we talked about it a bit, and I realized, it's out of his focus, right? So he doesn't see it. And so we go back, and I talk with the artist, and we're like, okay, maybe if there's actually animation of it coming in, somebody will see it. So we put an animation in, and we pull somebody else in to test. And the animation happens, and person just plays, and they don't see the animation. And I'm like, did you see the lever? And they're like, there was a lever in the game? And I was like, okay. And so then we iterated again, and we added sparkles, and then we added arrows, and we did all these things until finally people saw the lever. And it's really interesting because, imagine building a game that people don't understand one of the core mechanics. They'll never enjoy it, right? And so asking people, did you enjoy the game? They're like, I just felt like it was kind of this monotonous thing over and over again. There was no reward, there was no build-up, things like that. And so when we finally got that mechanic in, the enjoyment level skyrocketed. They were probably 3 to 4 times more enjoyable than that. And that was my first understanding of like, wow, UX is this thing that can completely unlock a game. And had a little bit of experience with it when I was working at id, but really, I really started to learn about UX when I started to work with Celia. I remember the first time she was like, I'm Celia, and I'm going to talk to you about UX. And she did this presentation, and I was like, science things. And I think you quoted like 47 articles and books, and I was like, I can't read that much. But it really did. It brought into focus all of these different types of things that we don't really think about, and we often don't think about during the day. And so, Celia and the lead designer and I were talking, and our lead UX designer, and it was like, hey, we're designing a lot of UI screens, we're designing a lot of interactions, it would make the most sense if at least twice a week we got together for 15 minutes and talked about the new things that we're working on. And so we started to bring that into our iteration process. And you can actually look at Fortnite, and you can see when UX started to be part of the early design process and when it was more the later design process. So we're still fixing things that are broken. And Celia and I often meet, and Celia is like, these things are super critical. And I'm like, everything is super critical. And she gets mad, and we yell at each other, and then we pick like 2 things to work on. And we all know she's right, but it's just a matter of what's priority. And so that kind of, every cycle, every team at least focus on one UX feedback. But now we're actually using UX even earlier and earlier in the process, to where our UX designers will build a paper prototype, or they'll build a prototype, just in Photoshop or whatever, and they'll send it over to Celia and her team, and they'll just grab random people at the studio and have them kind of mess around with it and get their feedback. And it's like, oh, well, none of that works. Okay, iterate. And for those of you who don't know, it's way cheaper to iterate with just one person building paper design and her team kind of looking at it and saying, fix these things, than it is when you're already fully implemented and at the later stages of the game, and you're like, hey, now we have to go fix something that has been in the game for a year and is broken. So we keep trying to bring it back even earlier and earlier in the process, and Celia is very persistent about this, always like, when can I test? When can I test? When can I test? And I'm always like,
Just looking at
maybe. And it's, again, way easier to have a build or just like a paper prototype than it is to have a fully working build that she can bring people in from out of the company and have them spend time playing. So it's really important that it's part of that early iteration loop and not just the later iteration loop. As you were saying, the earlier you can bring it in, the more value it is. So now it's really part of our iteration as our design, from our game design, systems design, to UI design, UX design, everything. We're trying to run through that scope and that window, because for those of you who don't know, Fortnite will be a very large game, and lots of people will play it. And people all over the world, and people who are in different countries have different thoughts on color theory and all these other things. And I can't store that in my brain, and our designers can't store that in our brain, but Celia can. So, so that's kind of how the interaction has worked kind of throughout my career. But especially now, it's the UX team. We not only have 2 people on our team that are fully dedicated to our team that are UX designers, but we also have the whole team, Celia's team, that is very much dedicated to working on our game as well as other games.
Yeah. I just wanted to take a little bit of time to thank the Fortnite team, actually, because it's been great to work with them. No, I'm serious. Because they're like, okay.
Don't, just tell me a little more.
So when I recommend something, I'm like, okay, we can try, and then we try it, because it's not that easy to tell people, hey, we should try something.
Yeah.
'Cause there's a lot of things going on. Making a video game is incredibly complex, you know that. So it's it takes some effort and open-mindedness to go on that journey with me. So.
Yeah, especially when you're like, everyone hated that, and we're like, no, and you're like, okay, it sucks, and we're like, okay. Crushing the souls of little designers everywhere. UX.
And then let me show all these examples and to advocate whenever I do a talk, I show these examples that didn't work in Fortnite. It takes incredible, courage to let me show all these things where the game is still in development.
Yeah.
So.
We have failed many times, but the failures are what we build on to success.
It's part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really sort of a core function of UX. I mean, there's a vision that the artists have and the designers have and the devs have for how this game is going to be experienced by players.
And we crushed that vision.
We don't.
No.
Yes. Thanks. No, I mean, our role is really to help make sure that players are experiencing that vision as they want them to, as the development team and the art team so on expect that experience to happen. Because sometimes it doesn't come across the way that the team wants it to. And it's our job in UX to identify when that's happening and help to make sure that does actually eventually occur. Mm-hmm. That the player experiences the game as the team wants them to experience it, gets to all the fun and the engagement, all the good stuff that's in there, and doesn't get stuck like completely missing a core mechanic like Grant alluded to, where they just don't understand how control works, so they miss 90% of the gameplay and all the fun. And that's really in a nutshell what UX I think is really about, is making sure that the game, that the fun of the game gets to the player and doesn't get hung up somewhere in the interface.
Oh, you can add archaeology in there because it's like you added all the ologies and you actually the game is buried and you guys are like, okay, dust it off. And it's there. The fun is there, but sometimes we bury it beneath our crap.
Well, and I think you having that experience of doing development design, you've kind of worn all of the hats. What UX, one of the nice things is that you can meld it with design, and I think at that point it really becomes powerful because you're designing for interaction. Mm-hmm. And if you can look at it as from that point of view, you can address many of the issues earlier on, so that it makes the whole process a lot smoother.
Yep.
Celia, let me follow up with a question. Do you guys have any rules when you're running participants about what the producers and devs can do and how they engage with either?
They cannot engage
No
at
engage.
all. No.
We cry behind the mirror.
I'm protecting the participants. Don't approach them.
I have very much screamed at participants before, like, how are you this dumb? Come on. And, we're like sitting there and they're like, they're going to press it, they're going to do it, and they miss it. And you're just like, no. So.
Yeah, I keep them behind the one-way mirror, and it's totally soundproof, so they can yell, they can cry. The participants don't see that.
Nice.
They do like, why?
Well, we've got good timing here, so we can take some questions related to this topic, the interaction between dev and UX. Any questions out there? It's hard to see. There's one back here, and then maybe right back here in the last row. I don't know if we can get a microphone to this
On the way.
gentleman, this blurry object back here, as I'm blinded.
Okay. So UX is it is more of a fundamental thing, and it affects the way gameplay is done. Obviously, Grant, you've seen that throughout your career and your multiple hats that you've worn. And it looks like a lot of companies now are hiring UX people to come in, right? Like, Celia, you have a PhD. You've been studying and doing this for a long time. Do you think there's going to be a transition at some point where a regular designer that's working on levels and stuff like that is going to have a background in UX and stuff like that? So when they're designing, they're fundamentally thinking about how this is going through this process?
I think it's already happening. What I found really crucial is to make sure that everyone on the team is actually owning UX. UX is not just the job of a separate team. Everybody is here to make sure that the audience is going to have a great experience. So, no, I'm not going to say that you all have to have a PhD in psychology, not at all. But you have to understand a little bit how the brain is working, just a little bit, like perception, attention, memory, like a few elements, and you have to be open and be okay to get feedback that this is not working, and be okay because it's difficult. It's your baby, but once it's out there, it's not your baby anymore. So you have to be open minded for that. It's not easy, but this is a huge part of it.
Yeah, one of the things, I like the baby analogy, because one of the things I always tell people about making games is it's your baby and you spend all this time building your baby, but as soon as you release it out there, it's running against Usain Bolt, and it's an adult, right? So you don't get to release it and be like, okay, grow like a small little butterfly child. It's like, you're out there and you're against Call of Duty, who has had like 13 iterations. And so you're competing at a higher level, so therefore your game needs to be easily, like, you just grab it, right? And one of the things, we often say, and I often say, is like, if you're on the team, you're a producer. Like, you're involved in making sure that things get done on time and things are getting done accurately and stuff like that. But you're also, your core focus, the core focus of our team is the user experience, right? Like, that's why, I'm gonna get a little producery here. That's why if you're using user stories, right, the entire focus and the idea of the term user story is that it is focused on the user, right? And that inherently is what UX is. So, anybody having any type of background and understanding has a leg up in design, especially. I mean, like I said, when I started doing design, I had no real idea what UX was. I just understood that people had no clue what was going on. So, yeah.
Yeah, the baby analogy is really apt too, because one of the sort of, I tell my students, it's one of sort of the core jobs of a UX person is to talk to someone about their baby and tell them that it's ugly. And then to help them to understand how they can make their baby less ugly. And that's an incredibly difficult conversation to have, as you can imagine.
You just had that conversation with me yesterday, Adams. So my kid is actually ugly, is what you're saying? No, I'm just kidding.
I'm
It's
taking
a
the
matter
fifth.
of perception.
Good question. Related to that question, what I've seen, we've worked with a lot of companies here. Everybody wants to be a user experience person because it's fun, right? And it's you're making games better. Do you guys have rules about when your report is delivered to the team, the UX report, who gets it first, and then how it's distributed, and what are some, and why would you have those rules?
Sure, we play a little bit by ear, and depending on the different teams, we do it differently. It's really important that the team we're working with has to be comfortable doing that because it's difficult, because it's like standing in the middle of the room being naked. This is what playtest is about. This is what UX is about. So you want to make sure that you're not showing that naked person who's the designer, like giving you the baby to test. Sure, you don't want to humiliate that person. Right?
Yep.
Everybody knows that there's going to be problems. Like, a perfect game does not exist. There are going to be some problems, and you want to make sure that that interaction is you're building trust. So you're not here to point fingers. You're just here to work with the designers to make it better. So if you send it to everybody in the company, it's not necessarily cool, because depending, it's just, even if there's everybody in the company understand that, it's just a bit difficult for the team to just have it out there and everybody can look at it. So it's better down the line when it's getting better and actually you can see the progress. Then you can open it up a little bit better and say, hey, look at how we progress, so the other team can actually learn from that experience. But at the beginning, you want it to be more like a closer interaction.
So just Grant gets the report in the beginning?
Yeah. Well, so usually the way we work is if someone requests it, so if one of our teams requests a test, then obviously the people on that team get it. I always get it. Most of the leads get it. But what we've started doing just recently in the last few months is before we schedule each big sprint or big milestone, we get the owners of the team and we sit down and we meet with Celia, and we go down through the list of what specifically is important to that team or what that affects that team, and we say, hey, are we doing anything here that is going to apply to this, or maybe we're gonna focus on this. And it's funny because when we then get into the room with the rest of the team, it's like, you're going to be working on UX feedback number 265, and they're like, what is UX feedback 265? And I'm like, oh, I forgot to retype out what that actually means. But a lot of times what it actually does is, everything is a priority. There's no such thing as a low priority because everything is a high priority. And so what it does is it actually highlights and kind of makes things more on fire. So it's like, well, we know we need to fix this at some point, but we're getting a lot of UX feedback. And with Fortnite, we're actually getting feedback from players as well. It's like we're getting a lot of UX feedback. And then on top of that, we're getting some player feedback, and that really like bumps the priority up. And Celia argues with us, and we're like, yeah, and then we do it.
He's just making that up.
Any other questions related to this topic out there?
Online, we had a question from Michael. He wanted to know, what are some steps they can take early on as a designer to keep in mind the user experience? So how do they design for the UX from the very beginning of the game?
I would say that, the first thing is do a lot of research and learn about UX, right? Like there's a lot of great books out there. There's a lot of great GDC talks out there. There's a lot of good ways to just start thinking in that mindset. That was what I did. I mean, I didn't have any formal training. Shawn, I think you had like mentioned UX or something in the class that I was in that you had. You were like, this is a thing. And I was probably like, that's a thing, But you have to start thinking in that mindset, which is what's most important. And start thinking about how does everything I'm doing affect the user. As a designer, you should inherently be doing that because that is your job. But you need to start thinking in the mindset of designing things for usability. I would say that was the most important thing for me.
And I think the end goal is like thinking, the game is for a player. And if you can keep that in mind, it is yours, but you can't have so much, it's not your precious, you can't hold on to it so much that you have so much invested in it that you're failing to connect with who your intended audience is.
Yeah, great answers. One of the things that I like to do is hand out free books to the designers and programmers, like books that I know work really well. And we hand out Universal Principles of Design. It's a big book here in a number of classes. And people like that because it's very piecemeal. It's like, affordances, make things so that if it's a push plate on a door, it's not pull, which we have a lot of those around here, oddly enough. But we'll continue moving along. We got a couple more questions to get to. We're going to go to Celia here. This is a very interesting question. What are the main misconceptions from people who sit next to you on the left? I'm sorry, no, just in general. Folks in the game industry. Yes.
Right here.
Main misconceptions from game devs and folks who work in game companies about UX.
Yeah. So this is a very interesting question because I get that very often. I actually have a name for it. I call it the Groundhog Day of UX. I get these misconceptions again and again and again. So one of the big misconceptions is people are telling me, yes, but you're gonna make the game easier, or you're gonna distort my game design intentions. So this is absolutely not the case. If you're designing a game like Dark Souls and your intention is to make people suffer, well, we're gonna be here to help you do that. So what we do is really making sure that we understand your intentions and what you want the player to experience, and we're gonna just remove the friction that prevent the player to experience this exactly. So it's not removing the fun, and actually there's not just usability part. We also look at the game flow part. So the perceived pacing of the game, the motivation about the game, the emotions that are conveyed by the game that the player is going to feel in the end. So everything is part of the user experience. Another big misconception is people are saying, but I don't have time or I don't have money to do that. So don't think about if you can afford doing UX. Think about if you can afford not to do UX. Because if you do not have UX processes, you actually gonna take more time to iterate on your design. And in the end, when you ship the game, you can have a lot of problems, UX issues that you're gonna find out too late. So if you do some UX processes, even with the means that you have, just learn a little bit about how the brain learns, how the brain works, iterate, test it with someone that doesn't know the game, but is going to be in your audience. target audience and reiterate, because this is going to make you gain a lot of time and your game is going to be more enjoyable, and if it's more enjoyable you can have more sales, and this is important because if you have more sales then you can do another game and continue do the things that you love. So these are two big misconceptions about UX. I can go on if you want.
Well, yeah, I think there's all kinds of stories you could probably tell about conversations you've had where you're like, oh my, this is going to be a long day.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, from your side, Grant, have you seen? You get to see other people, and you get to talk to people when Celia's not around, and explain UX. I mean, how hard is it over there?
Careful
Producer
with your
Hodent.
answer.
I like what you said about UX can remove the barrier to suffering. I think that's my new thing on UX. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely our lead designer Darren Sugg likes to say, you kind of said it already, bring people along for the journey. And sometimes I have to make sure that they understand the journey of UX, right? So I would say now most of the team has either gone through one of Celia's talks, and she does her GDC talks at the office, and now understands unlocking the brain or things like that. And so now they've all been kind of brought along that journey. But I would say, I've definitely had conversations with people where they're like, why does the feedback from UX get weighed above the feedback from us or the feedback from players? And I often just do this. I'm like, we're here, the player's here, right? Like, you're seeing only 3 things in the game, and they're seeing all the things in the game. It definitely, it is a thing that you have to work with teams, and I think Celia and her team have done a really good job integrating with our team. But at other jobs I've had, it was a struggle. Like when I was at ID, Bethesda had just decided to have a UX and like focus testing team, and that was a struggle, right? So Wolfenstein was the first shipped game that they had that was fully tested, and a lot showed from that, and the success showed, and that's really all it took was like one success for that studio to understand, like, hey, there was a lot of good feedback that came from this, a lot of good science. Okay, next steps, right? But yeah, I mean, even there, I would be like, hey, let's have Stephanie was the lady who ran the lab. Let's have Stephanie and her team run a test, and people would be like, why? I don't care what they have to say, and I'm like, but they can help, and they're like, they can't help. And I'm like, okay. So it is a kind of a constant struggle until people understand it, and then when they understand that UX unlocks the suffering, then we're good.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things I see from teams that don't want UX is they say, well, all they find is known issues. It's like, we knew that already, but your company sounds like it's Celia is doing a great job. So,
yes.
But Theresa and Adams, any interesting stories, misconceptions, trying to explain UX?
Oh, sorry, I'm going to jump in real quick.
Yes.
A lot of times UX does expose the issues that are already known, but it raises the priority. That's one of the main things. But one of my favorite things about it is it's a lot of times the issues are symptoms, right? So you can be like, hey, yeah, we knew it was a problem that the player didn't understand, that's how they exited menus or something like that. But it's like that's just a symptom of a misunderstanding of how the game works or something like that. And a lot of times what a real person who knows UX can do is get to what the actual problem is, not just what the symptom is. And that's where the value comes in, is it's like, this may be a symptom of something that we already knew. The symptom may be something that we already knew, and we knew we needed to fix. Okay, let's raise the priority. But more importantly, it's, hey, here's what the actual problem is. This is what the players don't actually understand. So,
Yep.
Yeah, we try to dissect and find the reason why this is not working, and not just like pointing out, hey, this is not working. Well, we know that.
Yeah.
Well, okay, this we actually give some suggestions to how to fix it.
And for me, working with students, because I work with a lot of development students, so programmers typically tend to have a specific mindset that's more focused on algorithms. You give me a process and it works. When it's a more heuristic sort of process, it becomes, well, that's subjective. What grounding do you have to be able to tell me that that's the way that it should be? It could be anything then. And it's coming to terms with the fact that a subjective, more heuristic process can have validity and actually can be grounded in valid in things that you can take it back to. So for instance, one of the things that we deal with the mobile program is fun. You know, you're supposed to make a fun game. You know, and what the hell is fun? You know, and how do you define fun? So what we do is we try to take it back with the students when we're looking at that and not look at fun, but do they have a complete feedback loop? You know, have they addressed the issue of how they're going to reward players or punish players? And then have they addressed the issue of whether or not, you know, how severe that is going to be, and whether or not they're going to notify players that that's going to happen. So there's all of these issues that, you know, you've got these subjective ideas that players will kind of, that when you do a usability or UX testing or UX research, players give you one thing. They're going to say, well, the game wasn't fun. You know, it was too slow. It was too fast. One of the things that a UX team has to do is translate that information into something, into language that then the development team can understand or the design team can understand. You know, and I think a lot of it's bridging a sort of a communication gap, as Adams was mentioning before. He mentioned, you know, between the player and the console, or the player and the game. Well, there's also the one between, you know, the player and the development team.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I had an interesting conversation with Celia yesterday, actually, in which she was talking about one of the problems that often arises in terms of misconceptions, in terms of friction between UX and dev or art, is that when you're building a game, people are always really excited about giving you their opinions, right? I mean, everybody that you talk to about your game is like, oh, you should totally add more bunnies. Bunnies are cool, right? And so you get so many opinions from so many different people, and most of them are really not worth very much. And one of the things that I think is a challenge for us in UX is to make clear, is to communicate clearly, first of all, not just to have opinions, but to have evidence-supported results to provide. We're supposed to be closing the feedback loop, right? Bringing information back from the actual players of the game to the people who are building the game. And that's a big piece of this, but it's also like, when we're doing this right, we're providing data-driven, supportable conclusions that are actionable, that someone can actually look at this, okay, I can see why this is a problem, I need to make this work. So for instance, we were working with a partner a month or two back, and the problem that they had was that their players were not understanding a lot of core mechanics that they were supposed to learn in the tutorial process. And we weren't sure exactly why this was happening. What was the problem exactly with the tutorial? And we work with tutorials all the time, right? That's one of the sort of Achilles heels of games often. The interesting thing in this case is we found that there were actually a nested series of problems. There are actually 3 separate problems with this tutorial, and this is why it was sort of hard to understand what was going wrong. The first thing was a lot of people were simply not seeing the tutorial boxes pop up at all. We were able to identify that by using one of the techniques we use in the lab sometimes. We have an infrared eye tracking that we can use to figure out where on a screen somebody's looking. And that allowed us to identify that some percentage of participants simply were not foveating that particular piece of the screen. They never saw it. If they never saw it, there's no way they would have gotten that information in the first place, right? We also found it interesting, though, is that those who did see it looked at it a lot, like more than we would have expected, but they still performed badly. And we realized when we talked to them was that the problem was the text was really small, and they're having trouble seeing it, so they're squinting at it. So they spent a lot of time looking at it, but still didn't understand it very well. And so even for those who managed to get to that point, the thing we found also was that there were several icons that were designed in such a way that they were sort of misleading. The result that people who, even if they could read it, they would then hit the wrong key because they thought that it was a space bar and it was actually left shift or something like that. So these can get to be very complicated problems, and parsing that apart and providing actionable feedback is a big part of what we do, and is very important.
Go ahead.
You used a 100-point word there, foveating.
I'm sorry.
You should explain it a little bit.
Yeah, to foveate something is to put essentially the central part of your eye, the central part in your retina, looks directly at it. Basically, means
what is retina? I'm just kidding.
You're looking straight at it.
Yeah, question from the audience related to this. Yes, sir, over here, raising your hand. We'll get a mic to you.
Hi. Obviously, you mentioned earlier that there's you have the player and you have the game, but there's that middle of the control, the area between that bandwidth that's controlling that information. There's a game, Heavy Rain, that what it did that was very interesting is there's a part where you're trying to climb through this electric wire, and what the game does is it makes your hands placed in a position to get through that it hurts your hands and it makes you feel tension in the game. I thought that was very interesting. But how do you guys respond to new control schemes? Like Steam is coming out with a new controller that the analog sticks are instead touchpads. And then there's the Oculus where you can control which way you're looking with your head. How do you guys handle these different new controls?
That's a great question. Well, you handle it by prototyping, and you go in different directions and see what works best for the experience you intend. So, I mean, I don't know how I could go more specifically to answer that question, but it really depends on the interface and what you want to accomplish in the end, what sort of experience you want to have. But what you do is you prototype different solutions and different paths, and you see which is working best.
Yeah, I've kind of have experience with this. So I was working on touchscreen games right when the iPhone came out, and then multi-touch became a thing. And so multi-touch was basically non-existent when I was designing iPhone games. And so HP was one of the first companies to have anything multi-touch related, and they had a thing called an HP Touch Mart. And it was not a very good machine because one of the things that it did was it actually used cameras pointed down at the screen, and it detected where you were touching. So there were problems like your fingers crossed, the cameras got confused, and it lost positioning. So we probably prototyped for I don't know, a month, trying to come up with a design that was forcing you to use multi-touch, but then never caused you to cross your fingers, and never really caused you to do anything weird, and didn't put controllers on the screen, because that is like my absolute number one most hated thing. Is if you are designing a touchscreen game and you put controllers on the screen, I will break my phone and send my pieces to you and hope they explode in your hands.
Can I interrupt for a second? If any of my mobile gaming students are watching this presentation.
By the way, I actually did a presentation directly about this at PAX a few years ago. So if you're in the mobile program and you would like to watch me get up and scream and rant about this for an hour, it exists. It's on YouTube somewhere. You know, that was a new thing. Not only was that new for us, it was new for people, pretty much in general, theoretically, but not actually, right? Because the main way we interact with the world is with our hands, right? And we don't usually use one finger to interact with the world. We use two hands. And so when I started to think about games using like two hands, I started to think about board games, and I started to think about like actual physical space. And that just, it started prototyping. And then once we arrived at something, we let people play it, and it didn't work, right? So it worked to us because we had spent a month working on it, but it didn't work. And so then we iterated, and that's really it, right? You just keep trying new things. And if you're doing something innovative or weird, I've played a lot of games that do interesting things like Heavy Rain, where they're forcing you to do weird things with your hands, or like turn things because they make you want to feel tension. You know, if you play a game like Spec Ops: The Line, that entire point of that game is that the game doesn't feel good, right? Like, it doesn't play like Gears of War on purpose. It plays like shit because you as a player are going through the psychological downfall. And so because of that, like, the game doesn't play well. I can't imagine how they UX that, because the early levels, you're like, it plays like Gears of War and it feels super responsive. And then the later levels, you're like, I tried to aim at this dude and it took me, 5 milliseconds to aim at him. So there is intent of what you're trying to do, and then iteration on trying to find something that works. But if you're trying to do something innovative and new, you just want to make sure that the player understands what that is.
One thing I'll add with that is to determine how much space you have in order to be able to do something new, because if you have to pay attention to established conventions as well. You can't just completely throw out what players might be familiar with, because then you're going to confuse them, even if that might be better than what was out there before. But if you do have a completely new room, new space to create, it gives you the opportunity to use UX techniques to be able to establish what would be the ultimate best experience for them. With the Oculus and the Gear VR, we actually had a student who was doing a mobile title for Gear VR, and it was interesting to watch him kind of struggle with that, because there was a lot of struggles with the UX on that. Initially he had it set so that you would be able to turn your head with the headset, and that would tell you where you were going, and that caused confusion. So what he ended up doing is adding a different control system in that, so that you weren't needing to turn your head in order to be able to control where you were looking. So again, it's a lot of experimenting, collecting data, and responding to that data appropriately.
And VR is really interesting, right? Because you'd think, oh, you just mimic the real world, but you can't do that. And there's been a lot of papers and studies on that because, acceleration and just movement in general, like if you're like, oh, I look around and that pans the actual room, like that's actually really kind of slow. Like the way we move our head is like, in game you kind of want to make it a little bit faster, but if you make it too fast, then you get dizzy and you fall over and die, right? Like, so there's a lot of new things and new studies. If you're going to do anything in VR, there's a host of white papers that I very much encourage you to at least read the abstract, because otherwise you are going to be physically ill the entire time you're working on the game. And it's interesting because, again, you think, oh, well, we're getting closer and closer to just mimicking real life, but that actually makes UX, in my opinion, more and more important because I've never designed a game to mimic the way my hands really work in life or the way my head actually moves, because we always have something. Even with VR, there's a layer in between the real world and you in the game. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and this is how it's important to understand how the brain works and how you have to take that into account when you design new interfaces or new experiences. Like, for example, VR, again, the big challenge is proprioception. So proprioception is your sense of body in space. Like, for example, if you close your eyes, you are able to touch your nose unless you had a lot of drink. And typically in VR, if in VR you're speeding up, you don't feel it in your body. So this is a feedback that you're missing, and your brain is freaking out because it doesn't understand what's going on. So just like understanding how the brain works, understanding the mental model the user is coming with is helping to prototype and figure out if it's working or not.
Yeah. Hopefully that answered your question by going way farther.
Yeah, you just asked a bunch of scientists how they play with new gadgets. So that almost ate up all of our time, but we do have time for one more question, and maybe two. We'll go up front here to the right. Go ahead. We have a mic.
Shout and we'll repeat the question.
So I have a question actually from Sebastian Long. We met him at the GR Summit, and he wants to know what the qualitative differences are between something like early access feedback compared to like playtest feedback, and how much you weigh early access feedback.
In alpha?
Sorry.
In alpha?
I'll repeat the question. So basically, how do we weigh feedback coming from like early access or like Fortnite currently in alpha against UX feedback? Is that a good summary? Well, I would. I have my opinion, and Celia has her opinion.
I don't give opinions.
Yeah, so she gives facts.
Science.
So again, it comes to the same thing where it's like everything is a priority, and a host of feedback gives more priority, right? So if we're getting UX feedback, it raises the priority of things. If we're getting feedback from like, say there's 3,000 people playing Fortnite right now or something like that. If 15 people are like, I don't like this, okay, that's kind of like a very low bit of, man, I wish I had a whiteboard, a very low amount of, of bumping. But if 2,000 people are like, this isn't working, more than likely Celia's team has already found that and it's already marked as critical, which then bumps that up, which then bumps that up to me, which then bumps up priority, right? So one of the things that's interesting, again, is players report symptoms. They don't report problems. One of the things that I love about working on a game that we're getting feedback from the community is a lot of times the feedback is very succinct, it's very correct, it's very, yes, we know that, but now you've enhanced our priority. But what's really cool and what excites me about working on it is the feedback that I know we're going to be getting, which is like, add jetpacks. Adding new ideas and like things and seeing how players play when there's 3,000 of them as opposed to 300 of them or 30 of them or 40,000 of them. It's going to be different, and we see trends, right? So feedback from people playing the game is a combination of reading their post, communicating with them, playing with them, but also all the hooks and metrics that we're getting, right? So we can use all of the data to kind of be like, okay, that's what the actual problem is. Let's weigh that against. But again, it's so far it's been pretty shockingly accurate that if a host of people have a problem with it, Celia's team has already told us it's a problem.
But to answer your question, is we have hypotheses, and we're gonna test them all along the way. And at the very beginning of the game, the development of the game, we're gonna bring people in to watch what's happening, how they behave, so we can answer a hypothesis. But sometimes we're gonna need to wait until we have early access and get more data to have analytics and see what's going on. But it's really always super important to know your questions and not just look at the data. Ooh, data, it's cool. What does that mean? I don't know. So you want to come up with your questions, and we have different tools to answer these questions at different times of the development. And sometimes through analytics, you will find something's happening. People did not do that, but you're not gonna necessarily know why. And then from that, you're gonna build up new hypotheses and put new hooks to answer that question. And we can also bring people in the lab to try to reproduce that problem and see why this happened. So it's really kind of like, I have tons of questions, and we have different ways to answer these questions, and these are just two different ways to answer these questions at different moments.
Yeah, it is really cool, though. I mean, this is my first time.
Never stop talking.
He's never, no.
It's just one of those
Grant,
things.
they already stopped recording, so.
No, it's one of those things where, I just find it really interesting to work. I've worked on like box products or whatever, where you like work on a game, and then you're like, game, and then people are like, I hate it, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't do anything about it. But now it's like, hey, I don't like this, and the community is actually really informing us about a lot of things just because of the vast number of people giving feedback. And to me, it's the new way to make games, and I don't see why you wouldn't make games any other way, because it's way cooler and way less risk averse, to be honest, because you're getting people who are excited about your game in to play the game, and they're giving you great feedback, and you're working with them as a community to build a great game, as opposed to just releasing it and hoping that people like it and that it sells well.
All right. Well, hey, big round of applause for all of our panelists today. And I think we're all out of time here, so I'll hand it back on over to the side here.
Thank you guys for coming up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you again to our panelists. And as you guys exit, you can use these doors on this side of the room. Thank you all.